Alrighty, so now we are live. This is the second round of our API review of the, I guess, DOM APIs for the release.json. Jacques, do you want to take it away and give us a quick summary of what changed since last time?
Yeah, I had a long, hard look at all the feedback, so thank you very much for that. Mostly a lot of renames, going like from all the releases and the release index stuff to like using the groupings we talked about last time, like the overall concept of like a release, which previously or a channel that would have been something like .NET 5 or .NET Core 3.1. That has now all become a product, essentially. And within that product, you can now have releases. So if you look at the 5.0 product, you would have 5.0 preview 1, preview 2, RC, etc. I got rid of all the numerals. Everything's backed now by collections underneath. For the product grouping for the releases JSON, I just extended the product collection, the read-only collection. So I created the product collection. I get rid of all the sync methods. So given that the time when there's actual I/O happening, which is either to get one of the JSON files and parse it, or potentially if you have a release and you want to like download something, all these files are typically hundreds of megs for some of the installer files. So everything is async. I brought back the support phase enumerable. There was a string type last time to deal with potential unknowns that have been introduced from time to time. So if we hit one of those unknowns, we'll set the support phase just to an unknown for the time being. And we support, I don't think they would change too much because we cover preview and RC now. LTS won't change, end of life won't change. So I don't see, unless we end up doing something weird like a beta or something that's tagged as an alpha release or something like that, that will just go to unknown. The iRelease interface is gone. That's now backed by an abstract class called release component, from which all the SDK and runtime releases derive from. And I think some of the ambiguity has also been removed in the process, where we said like, you have a release, but it didn't implement iRelease. It was actually something like ASP.NET Core Runtime or the Windows Desktop Runtime that implemented the iRelease, and that was confusing. So that's all been removed, I think. So yeah, that's about where we stand at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess it would probably make sense to just start with the innermost component again and then just see the flow from there, right? So
so that would be product collection probably. Which, yeah.
I see. So let me just, I guess now I have to fight with Windows here because I have now virtual desktops going here to make my life easier, but I might have made my life harder, so we'll find out.
So one question I had about the product is there's the latest runtime version. And so it kind of comes back to that kind of ambiguity between what we're calling the runtime and differentiating that from the generic runtimes. And so the latest runtime version was a little bit confusing on this particular class. And that was something that still is a little bit, I find confusing. I understand the underlying problem, but wanted to raise that as a discussion point.
Yeah, the latest runtime version, I mean, it should always match. Like if you look at the 3 runtimes, they should all, within a release, and you're looking at the latest release, all 3 of the runtime components, if they are present, should be the same version as what the latest runtime is. The thing that typically has a completely different version, I think, is the SDK, and that's likely why those were introduced originally. So while the SDK would ship that particular runtime, you could have multiple SDK versions. I don't think that maybe completely answers your question.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure
Is that
where. So, sorry, the question was like, where are version numbers here represented at all? They aren't, right? Like, I mean, you basically get the given release file, right? And then you go from there, right? Or maybe I misunderstand the question.
There are release versions. I mean, the release version, anything that has like a release version type is where we have like the actual version. So if you look like, if you go like from the product collection, which will give you back a product.
Oh,
right?
you
So
mean like
that's
once you
the
actually
old
look
chunk.
at the details of the document? Yes.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Then you'll see there's a latest runtime version and a latest release version. Michael, is that the point that's confusing for you? The latest release and latest runtime version, or?
No, it is specific about the runtime version. I understand that what you're saying in that the runtimes right now all have the same version. I guess that's the question: is that a guarantee?
I'm a little confused here, and so this, I don't know if this helped clarify what Michael's saying, but it's not all working for me right now. So a release can be of just the runtime, or can it be of any of the main products we track, like SDK, ASP.NET, or runtime?
A product release is the full. So think of the product as what we previously had, like as the channel. So .NET 5 is your product. Within that, you have a specific release of that product, which says like 5.0 preview 1. Within that release, it is made up of a number of components. It has potentially 3 runtime components for core runtime, desktop, ASP.NET, and then it has one or more SDK release associated with it as well, or SDK component rather. That makes up the whole release.
So those are components. Great.
Those
so
are components of the release, yeah.
Right. Okay. And so the release version is what we brand it as, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Because sometimes we release on the runtime version, and in a few exceptional cases, we've pivoted on the SDK to say this is the 21700 release instead of tying it to a runtime, because maybe there was no runtime. Yeah.
All right. So I'm just trying to think through Michael's question. So I'm trying to find where that latest runtime is. Is that on product release or on product?
It's on product.
It's on product.
So yeah, so I'm going to say that I'm basically confused. I think having that data available is super important. I'm confused about it being a property instead of a method to get the latest runtime version. And also, it doesn't have a latest, oh, it does have a latest release version. Okay, I'm sorry, I just overlooked that. So if we have the latest release version, what's the value of having the properties for the latest runtime version, the latest SDK version? And Michael, I'm sorry if I just stomped on your question. I kind of had the same question, and I'm trying to phrase it in a way that makes it concrete. So I'm sorry for that. So yeah, couldn't we just look at the latest?
That was just exposing what's in the JSON. If we think that that's maybe not necessary, because if you have the latest release, so the SDK version definitely would only give you the highest SDK version within the release if there are multiple SDKs. Right, so think of something like, what's a good example? 2.1, where 2.1.22 ships the 800, 600, and 500 SDKs. The latest SDK would always be set to the highest feature band, even if there are multiple ones within that release. So it will always be like 2.1.8.1.0 or something like that, right? Unless you go into the release and actually look at the SDKs, then you'll only find there's a 500 and a 600 band, for example.
All right. So now I'm confused about using the word release, and I have two questions. So let me ask them separately and shortly, and then we can go there. One is that I think you touched on a really important point, which is to what degree should this API reflect the underlying JSON file, which is definitely where we started, and to what degree should it reflect what the user might think about it? The second question is tightly related, because as a human, when you say release, I think of something I can go and download, something that has a URI. And if you're saying that multiple SDKs could exist in one release, then in terms of the files we create, those are separate files to download. And so I'm not sure for me if the name release feels right for basically the major minor grouping, whatever the right name for that is. It seems like that's what you're, and I think you might want to mute it for a second.
The release is not a major minor grouping. The product is the major minor grouping, which previously was the channel. So the 5.0 channel, you now think as a product. The release would be something specific like 3.1.2. That's the release that you get back.
But 3.1.2, how does 3.1.2 have an SDK? That's what I meant. How does 3.1.2 have a group of SDKs from, and maybe I'm thinking about this problem wrong, that's why I'm asking the question. I am thinking about the problem from the perspective of the files we create. And is that a good way to think about the problem, or is there a better way to think about it?
Trying to think. Why would you want to bridge it on a file first? Because in order to find a file, you would want to know with what version of the product you're potentially dealing with first, right?
Well, not necessarily, because if I think of the SDK as something I want the highest version of the SDK that's available, and what target runtime it runs against is not important to me, which is the mindset we would like our customers to be in. You know, they're not right now, but we want them there. Then making a strong connection between the underlying runtime the SDK happens to run on and the SDK itself is not the way I think about the problem. So files was just a shortcut to say I think I think of a release as a more granular thing. I think I'm going to just be quiet for a second, let the conversation proceed, and gather my thoughts from the conversation. I'm sorry to be a pain, Jack.
No, it's okay. I've just been so knee-deep in this for like the last few months in the JSON and stuff. So, I mean, the release so far, everything how we've approached this publicly, even like when we announce like a new release, it's runtimes and SDKs. They always go hand in hand. Like it's the sort of the cohesive unit of this is everything that we're making available today. Like these things all go together, and there's different parts of them. That's where the release components come in. And yes, there happens to be a runtime version associated with it and an SDK version or multiple SDK versions, but it's one cohesive unit.
So it's like our year identifier. It's like our except if we have a minor. So I understand that part. All right.
Well, it's like, you know, Rich posting a blog that says, you know, .NET 2.1.2.2 is just out. Go get it here. Like that's everything. That's the 2.1.2 runtimes, and it's the SDK that goes with 2.1.2.
All right. Like I said, I think I'll let the meeting progress, and then see if I have more questions. I understand what you're saying. That's what I needed. Thank you.
The other thing that was difficult for me to do was, especially with the renames, is there's a. I don't know if somebody would potentially go look at the JSON first, and then go look at the API and say like, well, I want that value in the JSON. Like, Now it was called like a channel. That was difficult for me to do, just to make that switch over. Like I look and see like, oh, there's something called channel. And I don't see channel doesn't appear anywhere in the API. There's now something called product and stuff. So balancing that is proving to be more difficult. Like in terms of what you see in the JSON, should there be a one-to-one mapping? What do people expect? I have no idea if that's how people would think about it, or if they would read the docs first to get an understanding of how we're trying to model it, and that the JSON is just, it was that way. We can't really change it at this point.
I mean, that's the general problem when you make your basically your internal schema like the public API, right? But I feel like that's probably not in the long run necessary, because once you ship this thing, you would tell everybody use this thing, and then maybe 2 years down the road you get to change the file format again, right? Because now you can say we have an abstraction over the file format, and if you read the file format directly, then you have 2 years time to move to the API basically. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I would generally say, like if you want to do the world a service, I would try to make APIs that make sense, rather than sticking to the names you already have, unless you think the names you already have are better. But just because they exist, I wouldn't necessarily use that as the driving decision point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what a lot of the comments were last time, was like the names and the confusion around the names. So.
I mean, I'm not sure that product is the best thing. I think that's what we said last time, but clearly Kathleen does have a hard time understanding what's going on here, so maybe that's not the best name then. The other question I have is, like, you were along the lines of what Kathleen was asking. So the latest release version, latest runtime version, latest SDK version, presumably they are part of the same structure that gives you the product already, right? So they are all one. You don't have to fetch any data for that, right?
Yeah, they're all just static fields on the at
and
that level. Yeah.
And then all the other stuff, basically we have get releases async. All of those always must fetch data, right?
Yeah, they go to the URI, or if you decide, for closed off air-gapped environments, if somebody needs to host it inside, you can change and override the URL. So that's basically why they're there. And the last one is just to use support any sort of caching mechanism where you want to download the file, you want to use the one that's on disk, but you might want to check online if there's like a newer version available and stuff like that.
So the one thing that I'm not entirely sure of is you have some data on the product that kind of has release nature in it, right? So for example, is security update. That makes no sense to me when you talk about a product. That makes sense when you talk about a release, right? So how do these two things relate?
So yeah, that one can probably be renamed. That one specifically relates to the latest release, whether it's a servicing release or if the last release contained a security update.
So it is basically just surfacing the security update nature of the latest release.
Yeah.
Then I would probably rename it to something like latest release is security update or something, to just make it sure like that makes sense to people.
That's clear. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And I know that we're working off of a JSON file that people did think about, but it is not impossible that we would have an SDK security issue that did not have a corresponding runtime security issue. And that seems, it's actually, because what would you say then if there was no runtime security issue, but there was an SDK security issue with the latest release?
Then there's still a security. Then it would be set to a security update true, because the release itself of whatever shipped.
Right, but then we're saying that there's a security update problem with one of the SDKs inside that release.
Correct.
So there is a security issue inside that release, but we don't know for sure that it's the latest SDK that has the security issue, And how are people going to use this flag if they're going to think this means, is there anything in this release that has a security issue? And we have a 50100 where the let's say we get things split. Well, it'd be 6. Okay. So let's say we get things fully split. So we can do separate SDK releases from the runtime releases, which is the world we expect to live in a year. And so we're bundling the SDK and the runtimes. Yeah, man. And with some of the stuff we're talking about on the runtime support for the SDK, with the SDK running on versions, I'm afraid our releases.json may have a problem, and the SDK and the API reflecting problems in the underlying file seems like a terrible direction to go. So if we get to a point where the runtime and the SDK are fully separated, and the SDK can run on more than one runtime, which is the world we would like to live in, so we can better support LTS. Then at that point, then we could have an SDK that can roll forward across certain runtimes. Now, we may not get there, but that is the general thing we're talking about, things like that to better support LTS. And I don't see how that fits into the releases.json structure.
Well, I mean, not just it depends on your mental model, I suppose, right? Because you could argue that the way the release.json is modeled, it's effectively, I think of this as like heading in like a logical grouping, right? So you would have a 5.0 header. Under the 5.0 header, you have the releases, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4. I mean, we don't do point releases, but 5.01 maybe, or 5.02, whatever the version number ends up being. And then within those, you either have a runtime release or an SDK release, right? Now, whether that SDK can run on 4.0 or 3.0 is kind of orthogonal to this, right? I think the problem you're pointing out, though, is very real, which is we use these version bands to where basically 100 and 400 could both be considered latest, right? Just one of them is for a different version of VS than the other, but they're both basically logically the latest release of the SDK. And then having a single
latest.
Sorry, what?
Only one would be latest, because that's a CLI concept. We use latest in the CLI, not for Visual Studio. So more than one could be supported, but only one would be latest.
Fair enough. I mean, if you rename is security update to latest is security update, or I guess latest release is security update, then that would only be true if the 400 version would have a security update, right? If the 100 version has one, then it would return false, right? Is that what you would expect?
Yeah, that's where I get confused on how we use the security update when we have multiple components in there, and some of those components will be grouped under either ASP.NET potentially, or certainly right now under SDK, and we could have multiple security statuses across those latest SDKs.
I mean, honestly, at this point, I would
belong to the latest release.
Yeah, I think at this point I would probably just say, like, what do you need this property for at all? Like, I mean, you could just say, okay, we remove that and say, if you want to actually answer the question, go do await get releases async and then issue your link query against that result, and then you can make sure you get the result that you want.
Yeah, because in the actual release, the property repeats itself again, like for every specific release, like say 3.12 or 3.11,
right.
And there's another property that says it's just like as more of a convenience when you look at the index and you say like, oh, my latest release is a servicing release or it's a security release. Maybe I don't care about servicing releases, I only care about actual security releases. That's the only time where you, at this point at least, where you would really want to use it.
I think that remembering that one of the reasons we built releases.json is to drive the current layout of a website, and that in that current layout, the first column says, is it a security release? And in that whole layout, we do not reflect the isolation we want to make between the runtime and the SDK. And so
you have to go one level deeper, I think.
Clear, but the direction we want to go forward, I think our safest bet is to remove that field entirely, and look at possibly some helper methods to help people get the answers to the questions they want. which is a separate question from this part of the API review. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly take it off because there is another way, like Emma said, you can go and query it. Plus, even if you hit a release, Kathleen, to answer your other question, any vulnerabilities that were exposed are listed on the release itself. They're not children from the specific release component. So the CVE doesn't hang off the ASP.NET Core Runtime or the SDK. It's the release that says this release addresses 5 CVEs. And that's all it tells you. It says, here's the SDK, here's the runtimes. You have no way to know whether that's CVE. Like, that's for somebody to go and actually like follow the link and explore like what the bulletin says and figure it out. But there's no way to look and say, if I have a release, which is the component that actually had the vulnerability? All I know is there was a vulnerability and it was addressed in this overall release. So if I get everything, I patch the vulnerability essentially. But there's no way to differentiate and say like, it's in this specific component and the rest maybe I can ignore because you don't have that information.
I am worried about that design. I understand we're reflecting Releasejson and that just changing it here may be challenged if we don't have the CVE on the component and the underlying releases.json. But as we have the possibility, and we have it today of a CVE, let's say we have a CVE against NuGet, okay? So people that we have, 1 million machines in the world that have a runtime and that is perfectly fine, and 100,000 machines that have an SDK which is vulnerable, and we're going to patch 1 million machines that won't actually be a patch because we haven't even made a change to the runtime. It's not even a different runtime. So how, with the clear possibility that the SDK can have CVEs that do not affect the runtime in any way, I definitely am concerned about our basic structures at this point on that, which is not a question for this group. It's a question for Lee and Jamshed.
I don't know that is security update here could even be used correctly. I can imagine a scenario where I'm checking this to see if I need to update the version of .NET on my server or something, and somehow I skip a security update and the next release is not a security update. It seems like the correct use of this, you always have to check all of the releases if you're interested in security updates anyway. So is that accurate, or is there a...
They are cumulative. So if you do a security update and then 2 servicing releases, the last servicing release would have any previous security updates rolled into it.
So as soon as there's one security update, every subsequent release will always be deemed a security update?
It wouldn't be deemed a security update, but it will be deemed to have included the previous fixes. So say we ship like a 3.13 runtime and we fix a security issue, and then we release 3.14, and that is a servicing release because there's a null pointer reference or something like that. If you have 3.14 installed, you will get the security fix that was included from 3.13.
Right, but I think the question still is
if the very latest one is not a security update, then I could have skipped a security update and not realized it by just reading the main index file.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically what you would have to do in order to do the check that Corey suggested, you would basically have to go over all releases where the version number is higher than the one you currently have and say, is any of them a security update?
Security updates, yeah.
And then say, oh, you probably want to fetch this one.
Yeah. And that information is on the product release, which then would make sense to take it off the actual product, which is essentially providing you a summary of just the latest, and then from there you have to draw further down.
But I mean, you could, instead of having the property, right, you could exactly do basically the helper method, right? You could say there's a method, an async method on product that says, has security update, and you pass in what you're currently on, right? And this thing gives you back a bool that says, yep, you probably want, or maybe it even gives you back the release that corresponds to, the first update that you should take that is a security update without getting feature updates.
Or you could like ask it like, get me the latest version that's also a security update.
Yep.
Get latest secure release or something like that, and it will give you back a version. And then it's just a simple matter of comparing that to what you have. And if it's higher, then you obviously want to update.
Yeah, so I have one more question. I mean, let's just start from the inner out first, so we don't jump all over the place. So let's finish product maybe. So the only question I have for product is create async the right verb? Because it seems a bit, to me, create kind of means you fabricate out of thin air, versus this one would really be more like load, because you're basically going to a particular URL and you fetch data effectively. So
yeah, but I can see that. I didn't want to use get because get sort of felt like it's finding something specific, and this was like a collection with all the product summaries, which is why I chose create, but load would make sense.
I like load.
yeah, I think load is the traditional way of doing it. I mean, load or get to me are kind of equivalent, because if you have get with no arguments, I would still assume, okay, it's going somewhere, right? Like I may not know where it's going, but clearly it's loading data from somewhere, right?
Yeah, it's not just like generating properties.
Right.
Using the word URL in the parameter, we might want to change that to URI or address. I can't think of any APIs we have that says URL right now.
Yeah, I saw a lot have used address. I mean, the reason why I picked it logically was just to differentiate between like, you need to point this to the thing that shows the releases index JSON specifically, or the releases JSON, and differentiate between those two. But that's the only reason. But yeah, I'm fine with address, and the doc comments can just clarify that, I think.
I would also probably drop JSON from this. Whenever the next format gets super hyped and we want to move to it, like we did from XML to JSON, then our APIs won't say JSON when we're fetching something else.
What? You don't think JSON is the permanent bestest? Never going to get any better format? There's a new thing. It's going to be called ZML. It's just like XML, but it's cool.
John, can you explain the get supported phases member on product collection? What's the intended use of that? What does
the intended use is just to know for all the products that I have. I mean, you can write it. It does a distinct basically in the back, but it's just to get a summary of all the support phases that you have. The typical place where I use it is like in my tool, I create all the available support phases, and then the user has filters on the command line that they can specify and say like, I want only things that have the support phase or things that do not have the set of support phases. So it's more of a convenience method, I think, than to look at the product summary and say like, these are all the products. What are all the support phases that I cover? Like, do I have? I mean, you can write the query and just get them all. You know, enumerate each product support phase and just get a distinct list yourself. It's really just for convenience. It's something that I've used in more than one place in my tool, that I wanted the whole list of everything that's in all the products. But I mean, I can just query it and just set up like a static property for it as well. I don't know how much convenience we should provide.
So one question I have is,
It's easier to add later.
so
I didn't catch that last statement.
It's easy to add APIs later if we find out they're going to be used by everyone. It's
start small.
It's an API no one uses forever.
Right, it's harder to take them away. That's kind of where I was thinking.
Makes sense, yeah.
For create async, I noticed we have some string parameters. I'm guessing these load from file. Is that a file path?
Yes.
Okay, we might
We can probably
consider.
change that to that just path as well.
Yeah, we might consider changing that to load from file, because we have some other APIs where string and URI are overloaded for convenience, and people might think that they can pass a URI in there.
Mm. So should we then consider adding a string overload that has that's essentially like the URI?
Yeah, we should add a string overload and rename this one to create from file or something.
Okay. And then on the product, while we're on the subject, should the get releases should that stay, or should that also then become like load releases to be more symmetrical with the product collection one?
I mean, to me, get releases is fine. I mean, that's why I said originally, like, load to me and get is largely equivalent, because they both imply they go fetch data from somewhere, right? That, to me, the real problem is that create kind of sounds you're just manufacturing something out of thin air.
Something, yeah.
Like, I mean,
But-
I'm okay with saying you just call the get releases also load releases async, but I would probably just go with get because it's shorter and kind of fine.
Sorry, Corey, what were you saying?
I mean, it would be good to be consistent here. I don't know why we would have load on one class and get on the other.
That's fair. I mean, I guess load to me, if it's the root, is kind of special, but yeah. I mean, we could just call it get async, right? That would work for me.
Yeah.
Or would you prefer load releases?
So get async on both,
Yeah.
because you know that you're dealing with a product or a collection, so
Yeah.
it's kind of implied.
The static here might make sense to move it to product release, and then we can have load async on that, and that way the instance methods can be called get releases, because you're getting the releases for that specific instance of a product.
Yeah, because it uses the implied Releasejson URI.
Sorry, I'm
But
like,
so should
what is the, like, I'm not sure I follow what Corey was saying. So what would you want to move? You want to move the static one to where?
so the product
move the
release.
static method to product release.
So the static get releases async method on product, you would move to product release.
Yes.
Yeah, because that creates a release from an arbitrary location, essentially.
Because it's not using anything about a product, it's just loading the product release.
I guess that's fair. I mean, it kind of, yeah. It is a bit weird that this, yeah, why does it return a collection of product releases rather than a singular product? I guess it depends on what the file is looking like, but yeah, if it, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't return a specific release. It returns like all the releases associated with a product. That is true.
The static read-only URI that we have on product collection, probably change that to a read-only property in case we want to change the URI in the future.
So I didn't catch this. What should change to URI?
Line 44.
Well, sorry, I'm confusing read-only with const here. But we should change the product collection URI to a getter property.
Oh, I got you. Okay. Yes, we should do that. So one thing I wanted to ask earlier about the support phases is, so what is this enum member thing? Is this a JSON.NET thing?
No, that's I think from the data annotation stuff. The way that the support phases are all abbreviated inside the JSON is LTS and EOL. But I figured it might make more sense to have a more wordy name for the actual enum member. So it didn't say EOL, but it actually said end of life.
And
so enum member is like an annotation saying what naming to pull it out of the file with.
Yeah. So when it does the deserialization, it will accept LTS and turn it into like long-term support, which is more understandable, I think, if somebody doesn't know what.
So enum member basically says it uses the numeric version. Is that what it says?
No.
Because I don't understand where the mapping from long-term support to LTS would come from then.
It just says enum member value is like LTS. So.
Oh, so then it's
the converter uses that when it does the enum conversion. It looks to see if it's got that attribute set, and then it will, if it finds like the LTS, it will find a member with a value potentially that has LTS, and then
I see.
So
assign the proper enum.
This seems like an implementation detail to me, not something that should be part of the public API, because we might change how we serialize it in the future.
Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, this is the problem when you serialize public types, right? I mean, you can, I don't think it's terribly bad to have, you know, attributes on public APIs because they're not really in your way. So I think that's fine. But the question is now, if you want to change it later, the problem is now when you, let's say, add or remove attributes from those members, do you expect somebody else to be broken by this, right? So if you put effectively serialization attributes on enum members, you basically tell other people that it's okay to serialize these guys. And you probably don't want to support that. That's why I would generally agree with Corey that you generally want to split your serialization data from your public API so you can version them independently. And you don't own somebody else's serialization now. But that's, I mean, I have a related question to this. So it seems like they are ordered by some logic. So, but what is that logic?
There's no logic.
It's just the order in which they.
I started with unknown, and then I just declared them.
I see.
The way that I remembered them. So, I mean, unknown is set to 0, but after that, there's no explicit assignments to values. Unknown is the one that has that.
This was just taken from the ref assembly.
Yeah, I just like uploaded the DLL to the API review tool. That's what it pulled out. So.
Yeah, I mean the ref assembly always has explicit numbers in there.
Yeah.
So I realize this is kind of a translation or surfacing of the values in the JSON, but to me the values here are conflicting in a way, specifically long-term support and maintenance.
Maintenance is a value that's been used before for end of life. And sometimes, and I think it's been fixed recently, but a few months ago, there were channels that said that the channel was in end of life. And then when you looked at a specific product in the channel, the product actually said maintenance. And then end of life became used more broadly. And I think, I don't know, Lee, you can correct me, but I don't think maintenance appears anywhere. And this was mostly, I think, in the 2.2 products where we had that old terminology associated.
Well, what would
Sorry,
what would
I just hopped in, but I think I caught the question. So maintenance is used to denote essentially the grace period from when a subsequent release comes out. So in the case of an LTS, 2.1 and 3.1, as soon as 6.0 is released, both of those will go into maintenance, and they'll be in maintenance mode for 6 months before they go EOL.
Okay.
so that was a little confusing to me. What would 6.0 be when it releases, Lee?
6.0 will be LTS when it releases.
Okay, then what happens when 7.0 releases?
7.0 will be a current, so that would only impact other current releases that are in market. So if we did say a 6.1 somewhere.
So current is a value that's missing here. That's what I was trying to figure out. I thought maintenance was what we were setting things that were current.
Yeah,
No.
I've never seen the current value before, so it could just be bad
Well,
luck from when I looked at the releases. So
yeah, what's interesting is the way our roadmap lays out, something being called. Well, okay, so 5.0 will be current. So that'll be the first one since 2.2 that will be labeled current.
okay. That would explain why I haven't seen it, because
Yeah.
2.2's been end of life essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. And then preview and RC are the only designations, or do we have actual alpha? Because I did find this was more specific on a specific actual download, but the early version of the Windows desktop runtime, the actual installer was tagged with an alpha pre-release.
Yeah.
Even though I think it said preview in the overall releases.
Yeah, so going back to, I guess it's in 1.0.1.1 we had this debate a lot. By the time we got to 2.0, we had kind of sort of mostly settled on, if it's not GA, it's a preview. And so that's where the whole preview thing came in. But then there was, other agitation to call something an RC so that we could make them go live and things like that. So now we have basically preview and RC, and I hope that's where it stops. But, Kathleen and other PMs that get paid more may argue for something else later.
We don't get paid more, we just yell louder.
I think maybe we're complicated enough. It's,
Yeah, I mean, I think originally I was one of those people who said, let's drop all these preview labels, because we used to have alpha, beta, and all of that. And that, to me, was not very useful. I think between RC and preview, that makes sense, right? Because RC communicates clearly, you already have a go live license. So that separation makes sense. I agree with Lee, though, that I hope that we don't reintroduce some of the other quality markers that we have. I mean, I don't know. I mean, to me, preview or very early preview is the same. It's like you're on your own.
And I think it's impossible to mark those across our entire product because, for example, we know that through much of the last 2 years, WinForms has been taking a big leap while ASP.NET was taking smaller steps. So the early previews of WinForms were quite different in quality than the early previews of ASP.NET. And so
Right.
I think that we just have too big a product to be able to say that we're any quality bar other than you can go live or not go live.
Yeah.
And that's one that we just have to make that one.
So, but then to just reiterate, so basically current is missing, we should add it. I still don't know when maintenance shows up.
Oh,
Let's use the historical example. 2.1 shipped, and we had declared LTS, so that one would have an LTS marking. We shipped 2.2, which was not LTS, so when that one was released, it was released as current.
Mm-hmm.
Then we shipped 3.0, and at that point in time, 2.2 was flipped to maintenance.
I see. So it's basically logically like a current, except it's not the latest current.
No,
Not
because
necessarily. It's an in-market release for which the its successor has also been released.
It's one that we consider the only reason it is out there is because we think you should have a little bit of time to get off of it.
Exactly.
It's definitely a get off of this one message, and it's yeah. To keep things simple, we don't do the same thing for the last 6 months or 3 months of the LTS cycle. Just say get off of it, and that's really the intention of the maintenance.
It's basically to tell you end of life is coming.
Right.
End of life is about to be here.
Yeah, and during the maintenance period, we will ship security releases, but that's it.
Yeah,
I see.
We're not doing any fixes unless it was just exploding the world.
So will we see this in the current model that we have moving forward? Probably not, right?
Yeah, we would see it at each LTS turn.
Right, so in December of 2021, we will see 5.0 in maintenance mode.
And December of this year, we'll see 2.1 and 3.1 in maintenance.
I see. So the state transition is you
maintenance.
Sorry,
Lee, do we LTS into maintenance? I thought we only put current into maintenance.
No. Anything that's about to get moved to EOL, we need some kind of signal. Yeah, we need some kind of signal to tell people that, hey, this thing is on its way to the dustbin.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I was about to ask that. So basically, it means you either start as current or as LTS, then you go to maintenance, and then you go to end of life.
Yes.
So Lee, that means today 2.1 is in maintenance?
No. So we remember we had this really weird state, and this was when we were still trying to figure out how to talk about what we're doing, where 2.1 and 3.1 were both listed as LTS, and so they've just kind of lived along side by side is what's happened.
Okay, so if we knew everything we knew, if we knew everything then that we know now, then when 3.1 was released, 2.1 would have gone into maintenance, but we didn't do that, and we're catching up.
Correct.
Okay, cool. That's no problem.
What about FTS? Would that ever come back? Because we had that in 1.0 and FTS. We made a distinction for FTS back in the 1.0 and 1.1 days.
Yeah, as we talked more about it, the FTS term is what became current because the FTS was just a little too confusing.
Yeah. Okay.
So 2.1, you said 2.1's going into maintenance in December, and then 3.1 will go next December when 6.0 is released?
No, both 2.1 and 3.1 will go maintenance when 6.0 is released.
Okay.
Yeah, because they can only be kicked off the mountain by another LTS.
Aren't we supposed to have 2 LTS versions? So this is slightly off topic.
I don't think so.
One is maintenance and one is an LTS, and we just have a weak case right now. And Lee, I wonder if we should consider kicking 2.1 to maintenance. We say that we give people a year to move, and so 2.1 is less than a year now. So we can talk about this offline. It has nothing to do with Jacques' API.
Yeah, we can totally talk about cleaning up the messaging now. Yeah.
Yeah, I could make a case for that. So let's do that offline. And I want to talk to you anyway. I don't think you had joined the call yet. I have a lot of concerns about the basic releases JSON structure when we completely separate the SDK and runtime. So I think you and I should do some forward thinking on what those scenarios might look like.
Okay.
So I think that answers all the questions for the support phases. So we're now done with support phases. We are done with product collection. We looked at product. Should we now look at product release?
That would be the next logical. Because that would be a specific release with all the components for that product.
So
I should maybe have mentioned like previously, like on the old one, because we had like the single entry of an SDK and potentially another block that was an array of SDKs. I just got rid of that. There's now just one thing that says SDKs. And if there's one SDK, you get one back in the collection. If there's 3 SDKs, you get 3 back. But the SDK and SDKs properties, there's just an SDKs property now.
So
Go ahead.
yeah, so like on the product release we have is preview. Presumably this returns true for both RC and preview bits. Should we also have a, I don't know, is go live, or should we just expose the support phase on the release itself?
So that is again a direct mapping of an attribute in the actual JSON that we literally look at, which it doesn't try to interpret any specific values. Like if the value in the JSON says it's true, then I return true. Which means if the JSON is incorrect, it will also return an incorrect value potentially. The one thing that would concern me if we did any form of interpretation is if the interpretation changes over time. People might become reliant on how certain values were interpreted, and then if we make changes, that would potentially result in incorrect behavior.
Yeah, that's kind of why I'm asking, like, what makes more sense? And I mean, exposing the support phase might not be the right thing because it doesn't necessarily make sense for individual releases. But I guess the question is similar to what Corey was asking earlier: is like, how do people interact with this, right? So, for example, if I do my link query against all the releases, and I'm trying to find the latest preview, then sure, I can just order by release and then just say where is preview equals true. But then I'm wondering, like, does it, like, it seems like you're not really exposing whether something is RC or not, right? So like, how would I do that at all?
Oh, sorry, I'm talking incorrectly. Is preview looks at the release version.
Is
right,
preview looks at the release version.
Release version, yeah. So the versioning scheme that we use, like we follow a semantic versioning scheme, though we don't follow the spirit of Semver, as a lot of people have pointed out.
Oh, I see. So release version.
If that is if that is a preview, so it has either like a build label or a pre-release label on it, and it's not a non-preview version, according to Semver, then it will return true or false.
I see. So basically, in your case, RC and preview will both be classified as preview because they both have a pre-release label to it, right? One is called preview, yes. One is called RC, right?
Yeah, and then for the distinction between pre-release, not preview.
Yes.
It's not a stable version. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess then to answer my own question, basically if you want to know what the latest RC is, you just have to basically write your query against product release .version .pre-release label equals RC or something.
Yes. If there is a specific.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that we have a set of functional questions that we're going to want to ask about these things, and that would be one of them, where that effort to find out whether or not our policy is that it would be go live. And I think people care about go live, not whether it's, I don't think RC, that those letters mean anything to people. But
I agree, yeah.
if we had is go live, and for now our policy is go live means that RC is the start of the name leaf, unless I'm incorrect on that. I think that kind of helper method we need to also add to this API.
I mean, it seems like you.
Policy.
Yeah, you
policy.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, from a policy perspective, declaring something go live, it's just happened that we've arbitrarily done that as soon as we've decided to go RC.
So RC is not the same as go live by definition. Great.
Yeah,
it's what I said, but we might want to say is RC as a helper method, so people don't have to go do that string manipulation themselves.
Yeah. So I mean, if we wanted somebody to know that. By asking questions of the JSON, then we need another property in the JSON, in essence, because that's not represented at all.
So does it mean that in today's JSON, basically the product JSON representation has the support phase baked into it, and then nested underneath it, the releases right now have no notion that they are go live versus non-go live anymore?
Correct. Yeah, it's either a, one of the preview designations that we just talked about, or it's one of the in support or out of support phases.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, as a general organizational principle, it seems to me the way I see the product is that whatever data or policy you expose on the product kind of makes sense on the release itself as well, right? So the release is basically a particular point in time of the product, right? So it seems like whatever policy you can ask the product, you should be able to answer that with the release itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me check something.
So whenever you have a case where something is answered by the product but not the release, I would say that's an inconvenient bug in your data.
Yeah, so we have the support phase in the releases index at the top level, and then it's also part of the top level collection of the JSON, but yeah, it's not in the individual releases themselves. Yeah.
Because all of this data is split out in multiple files and the top level file duplicates some of the data, is there a race condition when someone's querying all of this that they could see some latest release on their product and then they call git releases and they see an even newer release?
That'd be a pretty short time window. When we update any of these files in the GitHub repo, there's a task that runs that flushes it out to the production endpoint. So definitely possible, but it's a pretty short window.
Is that short as in a second or less, or short as in 10 minutes or less?
I don't know. It's whatever the copy task up to the Azure Blob Storage is. So it's.
Sure.
Although if the data gets missed, then you can have it, because I did for a short period. That's why there's a method called ease out of support, because there was one point in time where I noticed that the support phase wasn't flipped over and updated yet, but because when the product shipped originally, the end of life date was published, so it actually checks both the out of support phase, the support phase for end of life and the end of life date.
Mm-hmm.
And if either of those meet, because if there's a discrepancy between the data or a delay, then you might get the wrong information back. And I hit that once long ago.
Yeah, I think when you hit that, we didn't have the automation in place yet to keep the two locations in sync.
Ah, okay.
And so that got turned on, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago.
So do I get this right that basically we serve straight out of GitHub?
We do what?
So the release JSON file is served straight out of GitHub. There's no API in between, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so that means, to Corey's point, is like, yeah, you basically, there's no way to avoid race conditions, right? Because there's no database or anything that would ensure any sort of consistency. But I mean, I personally don't believe that's a huge issue, because we are not like, this is not one of those files that will be versioned super aggressively, right? It's like every time you release, which is like, less than a dozen times a year, right? Which seems reasonable.
I suppose one thing we could do with our syncing automation is we could take care of the flush up to the Azure storage into kind of a stage location, and then move everything to the production side with a single call just in a blob storage copy. Same situation applies, but I think the latency would be even shorter.
Yeah, I mean, it's the cloud, right? Like, eventual consistency is what you're chasing. So
No.
This isn't like the DLC like where we used to see like different regions have like different versions of something that hasn't propagated through the whole system.
Right.
Well, I mean, it could be solved fairly trivially through some versioning of the records, right? Like maybe the static methods shouldn't care about versioning because they're kind of independent. But if I call get releases on a product and it's inconsistent with the product model, that's kind of weird.
Right.
When you're thinking of the file format with Kathleen, maybe think of adding some sort of, versioning on the records so that calling get products or get releases could be consistent.
Could
Lisa's the master of this file. We can chat, but yeah. We haven't asked this file to do more than drive a website yet, and we're going to ask it to do more, and it may need a few tweaks from that.
Yeah, I'm totally game for making it better in non-breaking ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would it make sense, Lee, for the releases index when it's referencing the releases JSON to reference that by a SHA?
Entirely possible. We should, Kathleen and you and I and some others should probably just stick our heads together about some things that we're discovering are weak spots, and figure out how they'll play out.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think probably, Michael said you're interested, and we should probably include Jacques in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll try to set something up here while we're continuing, and let us sit down and.
I mean, one option you have is instead of serving it from blob storage, you could literally serve it out of a GitHub repo directly, right? In which case, when you commit, the files are logically consistent, right? Because we don't really care what the URL is, right? We just care that there's a URL that you can fetch the file from, which GitHub basically natively provides for any repo.
I will totally leave that to Lee, who's been managing the uptime on this, if that makes our life easier. Yeah.
Yeah, we can, like I said, we'll talk about all this, and the final endpoint, if correcting that is one of those things that will just make the world a better place, then sure. My thought was to divorce the thing that people relied on from the thing that we worked on, so to speak, in the GitHub repo, but maybe that wasn't a valid concern or thing to try and do.
And if I can ask a quick time zone question, Michael, are you in Pacific Coast, Fargo? Where are you at?
Central Time.
Central Time. Okay, I don't want to set this. And do you work until 5 local time?
6.
6 your local time. Okay,
so
thank you.
4 your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did I capture the last one?
Was there anyone else who wanted to be involved and look at the details? I think we probably have the key folks, but there might be somebody we're leaving out, which should also include. So let me know if you also think you should be there.
Okay.
Anybody?
So, are these APIs nullable annotated?
No, I don't think so.
So can any of these runtimes ever be null?
Yes, I believe there is there has been one instance. That is a good point.
Yeah, you may want to consider just nullable annotate your stuff. I mean, it's generally nice in object models where things are optional that you know which things are null.
Yeah. Yeah, there was one SDK, one release that pivoted on an SDK version which only contained an SDK and actually no runtimes.
The Windows desktop runtime would be null in a 2.1 release today, wouldn't it?
So the way it's structured in the data, like you would see an entry, like in 2.1, you would actually see entries for the Windows desktop runtime, like it would be there, but it would be set to null. And then in some of them, it's completely, like, it's not even there. And some of the other quirkiness is that you will find, especially in 3.0, the installer files for the Windows desktop runtime is sometimes exclusively listed in the .NET Core runtime and sometimes duplicated in the core runtime. And then in 3.1, they became fully separated as well. And I've had no good way of dealing with those. I mean, I know I can work around it in code, but yeah.
I mean, it seems weird. So when you say it's set to null, so when I now access 2.1's Windows Desktop Runtime, the property itself is not null, but now I go to, basically what amounts to release component. So that means now display version is null, files is null, name is null, release is null, version is null.
Like it literally says like Windows Desktop Runtime null. Like there's none of the other attributes and things or properties are listed underneath it.
I see.
And
So then on product release, that means then Windows Desktop Runtime would indeed be null.
It would be null, yeah.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me.
Yeah.
So this might be a bad question, but how do display version and version differ?
So the display version is kind of the prettified, generally only with pre-releases. Since we have, the preview dash build number hanging off the end of the actual version, the display version just cleans that up and does, preview.n.
And sometimes it has spaces, I think, as well, like instead of like the dashes and things like that.
So do you expect
at the beginning
people...
of all this, that was, well, the purpose of that thing was simply to give the marketing site a clean thing to display. That's where it's from. Yeah.
Mindful also uses it like when it's like running in like a query mode and stuff. When it prints stuff out, it often uses the display version instead of the actual.
Yeah,
but they wouldn't.
Sorry, yeah, wouldn't it make sense to then just the display version as a string? It seems a bit weird to return an actual parsed entity that, but you generally would not expect people to do comparisons on parts of the display version, right? Presumably you would just take it as a string and print it, right?
Oh yes, that should be a string. That's a.
Okay. Okay. No, that makes more sense.
Yeah, that is an error on my part. I'm sorry.
Also, hello everyone.
Hello. So one other question I had is on product release. You said everything is now a collection. Why is runtime still enumerable? You're muted, by the way.
It does it just disagree with like a union of all the of everything that's a runtime release component. So it looks for a runtime, Windows Desktop, and ASP.NET runtimes of all the components that are part of the release. It basically excludes. It's basically all the components except SDKs, essentially, that it returns. So that link query just spits out a non-enumerable, but it's backed by a collection underneath, which in turn is backed by like a list or an array or something. So I don't think anything gets exposed there.
No, I'm just asking. It seems a bit weird to have a property that returns non-enumerable because it's either it's something you compute, right? In which case it should be a method, or it's actually returning persisted data, in which case it probably should be I read only list or something.
Yeah, I can pre-compute it.
Yeah, because it seems like in your case, it will be a collection with like up to 3 elements, right? Or something like this, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a new runtime that gets added in the future, yeah. But right now, yeah, up to 3.
Yeah, I'd probably name it something like all runtimes so that we don't have the runtimes problem.
Yeah, that's also a good point.
Did you mean I read only there, Nemo, or just read only?
Yeah, so I guess you guys can see my actual screen, right? Not just the virtual desktop. Sorry, I was under the impression you only see one screen, so it might be slightly disorienting when I keep talking back and forth. So yeah, the idea, I think, to me, is just pick one. I mean, today you basically have the interfaces exposed, like I read only collection everywhere. That works for me, but I would not mix the two. So if you go for example, the runtimes, I would probably return as I read only collection rather than as read only collection at that point.
Fair enough.
But I mean, it's a good point because I think you also have some things exposed as read only collection, right? Yeah, here we go. So yeah, I would pick a strategy.
Okay.
I mean, I think again, backing them by read only collection is generally what you want because I guess in get releases it probably doesn't matter because you probably get an array and return that. That's also fine. But like the fundamental problem is when you actually expose data structures that you keep around yourself, and then people can cast away the read-onlyness and just mess with the data structure. That's a bit of a problem, right? In this case, I mean, you probably compute an array, return the array, and if the person messes with the array, no harm is being done in the sense next time they call, they get back a new array anyway. But like it's really problematic for persistent things where now your object model gets inconsistent because somebody somewhere did something wrong, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of types, just pick a strategy. We generally prefer classes, but in your case, it probably doesn't matter too much. I'm gonna actually put this as a generic thing.
So while we're dangling with like the release components at this point, there is a files property, which gets you all the files after release. And this is maybe a question more for Lee. I was wondering, should I do some magic? So internally, we have a number of files, and it's mostly on the Windows and I think on the Mac OS side as well, where we have installable files that look like the actual installers, but they have special names. They either have a -gs or a -nj suffix or prefix, and those I believe are used for marketing purposes.
They were used for marketing purposes. They no longer are. So wherever those things stopped, they're not going to come back ever.
Okay, so if somebody asks for the files, I should just exclude the ones with the GS and the NJ suffix that are still around, just so that people don't get those.
Yep, totally internal.
Okay.
So we talked about product release. I guess release component now.
Yes.
So we already talked about that one as well, I think. So interesting.
Yeah,
so the release component has a pointer back to its release. I like that.
Yes, I have yeah, that was one of the benefits of going with the abstract class and actually parsing the JSON directly, because I have found myself a lot of time going all the way down to like an SDK release, and then it's like I need something back from the top again to find something related. So
Do you want to do the same thing for product release? Being able to go back to product?
so in like writing some code with like the new revision of the API, I ended up writing like a little wrapper for myself called I can't remember what I called it. I called it like the release manager or like a product suite or something like that, where I added some extra wrappers, and that was pretty simple to do. I haven't had a need, I think. I don't see people having more than one instance of the product collection potentially active at one point.
So normally
every time that
you
I've
would
used it, it'd be like global essentially available. So that one would be easy to get hold of, I think. I mean, but that's just from my usage. So it's.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played with the API, but I think the question is still like if you for each over the thing, and then you're clearly in the inner part of the body, you still have access to the variable in the outer side. But as soon as you pass these guys around and do something like you print something somewhere, I can see the need. It's convenient if you can just go up by one, but I don't think
By
it's
one level,
critical. Yeah, it's just usually with object models. Whenever I didn't do it, eventually somebody said, "Why can't I do that?" And then if your design wasn't really meant for that, it might be very hard to retrofit later. But that's up to you, because I mean, whenever you have these like back pointers, it depends on how you construct these guys, where it gets tricky at times.
Yeah, because I'm doing it like during the JSON parsing, it's sort of like internally it's easy to do, but
Right.
it would also like make it more symmetrical in terms of the components go back to their release and the products can go back to their collection or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, I can see the benefit potentially for that.
It would have to be nullable though, because you can load a product release independent of a product with the API, right?
Yes, they're completely separate. Like with the old design, we like had like a bad design where you had like essentially a lazy getter that did like a lot of the IO and pulled like stuff down for you. So if you want something like that, you have to construct. Like for my convenience, because I always deal with everything at once, I have a sort of like a helper class where it adds everything, and from that helper class, I can head into like either the products or the specific releases of a product and just like do them. But they're separated now in the new design. I don't think there's an easy way to go back from a because a product doesn't store the releases, it just gives the releases back, right? Nothing, it isn't persisted on the product. So I don't think there's an easy way to come back from the releases to the product. Unless there's some property that potentially caches it, but then you've got a property that's going to be doing IO.
Well, why would it be hard to go back? I mean, like basically the only way you get to a product is via this method here, right? In which case you're standing on the product.
You're standing on
we
the
have
product.
the static. We have that static method, right? That we were
Oh,
going to remove to. We
so
were
this
going to
one,
move
yeah,
to
yeah.
the product release. Right. The earlier suggestion was to move that to the product release. So.
Yeah, that one might be hard. I mean, like you could potentially just fetch the product, right? Because you're already doing IO anyway, but I can see that being not convenient, yeah.
I mean, it could be a nullable property which is set if it came from a product, and if you open the release directly, then it's null.
Yeah. At that point, it's probably better to not have it at all. Because if it only works in some cases, then it might be harder to reason about. I have a general question, like, do you actually have constructors on most of the stuff? You do, sort of, right? Not for all of it, but for some of it. What's the logic by which you decide which things have constructors and which ones don't?
So for the index file, like for the product, the actual product itself, that I don't think I actually did a constructor because I just have like a private constructor because it can just be like serialized straight up. The ones that do have constructors are more like the actual release and the release components, where I actually sit and parse JSON more by myself. I take a blob of the JSON and I pick it apart to get the information that I want.
So I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but basically you're saying for things we use the type itself as the serialization as the serialized representation, you have a constructor, or because it seems to me weird that I can construct a product in the CVE, but for example not a component. Like it seems like part of it is just instantiatable, the other part is not.
Wait, the CVEs, that's not right. The CVE shouldn't have. No, because that was some of the stuff last time that. Oh, I see.
Yeah, because if you serialize them directly, right, then it makes sense because probably the JSON framework wants the public constructor for that.
I don't see a constructor, Mike. I don't have a explicit constructor.
Well, I mean, that's certainly also in the thing you uploaded. So it's not just me making it up. Maybe I'm not taking the latest version? No, it's the latest version.
No,
I see it.
version. Oh.
I mean, if you don't have a constructor in source, C# will generate one, right? So like if you don't want a public constructor, you have to explicitly create one and make it internal.
But yeah, but that one shouldn't have one. The idea was to get rid of like as many of the constructors as possible.
Kind of on a related subject, the types appear to be immutable, except for version. The release version, you can change the major, minor, patch, and pre-release. Just an open question of, was that intended?
No, I don't think that was intentional. You should just be able to construct it from the constructor and not just go and change those, because they're always going to be red. I can't think. Yeah. Oh, you know why that is? Yeah, this is a leftover from my tool. There are places where when, but this gets like into a lot more of like the nitty gritty stuff that I don't think we want to expose. But there are some cases where when I look at something that's installed on a machine, I need to I look at like a raw like Windows installer file, right? So I look at an MSI and stuff, and I try to figure out like this thing, where does it belong in the releases? And I don't have a lot of information. I have a partial version like in the actual entry that goes into add remove programs that sits in a registry key, and I've got some version information, but it's mangled and compressed, and the bits are manipulated. And from that, I try to artificially construct something that would look like a release version, to then potentially pinpoint where it fits in the whole releases, especially for things that are not officially publicly released. So think of like daily internal builds and things. Those are often the situations that I have to deal with, and then I have to like classify the product. So then I want to be able to manipulate the versions as I go through different types of heuristics until I find something that sort of makes it classifiable.
But why do you need to modify the one version instead of just building new immutable ones?
Because at that point, I'm manipulating bits on like instant stuff that I just want to quickly shove in and change the version. I don't want to construct a string and then start from
No,
that.
but like it could have a constructor that exposes all the pieces, so you can build it very specifically instead of doing string parsing.
Right, yeah, but yeah, the way that I did it is like I start with the version that I initially create and say like, oh, I think this is the version, and then I just start manipulating the version like that instant. But yeah, I get your point. Yeah, I can just construct new ones. That is true. But that's the only reason why they exposed the setters for me.
So like, is this still needed, or can we remove that?
We can remove the setters, yeah.
And then also iClonable probably as well, right? If it's
It wouldn't make sense
immutable,
if it's not.
why would you ever want to clone
Yeah,
it?
because this was a version. Yeah, if it's fully immutable, then I guess not. If the status goes away, then clonable can go, because yeah, it had the when I originally like did the implementation, I sort of looked at what version implemented, and because it had the setters, then yeah.
Whatever it's called. What is the precedence comparisons that you have? Like compare
That is
precedence
the-
and precedence
that's,
equals?
That's similar to comparisons, because they are technically similar to, except for like the additional concepts that we have for like feature bands and stuff like that. But you can do similar precedence where it like looks at it ignores it takes the pre-release label into account, but it ignores the it's called or it ignores the pre-release, but it like takes the patch into account. Is that the one?
So is there a
Sorry,
reason?
the build metadata, yeah.
Is there a reason why you have, like, it seems your naming is not entirely consistent here, because you have equals and precedence equals, but you have compare to and compare precedence. It seems like you should either pick with a prefix or a suffix. So you could either say, precedence compare to and precedence equals, or I would go with equals precedence and compare to precedence, but just pick one.
Okay. I see.
I don't know. I think that compare precedence and precedence equals, while it does feel a little asymmetric, it sounds more natural language, assuming that, I guess I don't know what the precedence means here, but if it was comparing only a precedence value, then compare precedence is the English way, and then precedence equals is like we say reference equals. It's where equals is the thing that you want at the end of that phrase for reasons that my neural net says is true that I can't explain.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing is like you have compare to, but then you have compare. It seems like, I don't know, I would just try to make sure they appear in the places you want.
I guess, yeah, precedence compare isn't terrible, but I wouldn't do equals precedence.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I would just suggest go with precedence compare to, right?
Yeah. What does precedence mean?
That's the similar precedence. Like if the pre-release is the same, but the bold metadata is ignored. So if two versions only differ by the bold metadata, then they're considered to have the same precedence, I believe.
Okay.
Also, what does toString field count do? You basically just pick how many components you want to see?
Yeah,
Like
same
major,
as version
minor?
to string. Like version to string, yeah. If you want major, minor patch. Or pre-release or bold metadata.
Makes sense. And then I guess the comparisons that you have, they are all consistent with what compare to does by default, right?
Yeah.
So basically there's no operators for doing the precedence-based comparisons. Correct?
No.
Yeah.
That is, yeah.
That makes sense. All right, that's kind of what I would expect. Cool. I think we just skipped over a release file.
There's nothing interesting there except there's one download where it gives you the option to verify because the file hash is recorded. So if you
Right.
it has the option to verify that for you. The other one by default doesn't, obviously.
So when the verification fails, do you delete the file? Do you throw an exception, or like what is the behavior?
Don't. So I was trying to find out like what I should do if the hash fails at the moment. The best thing that I could find was to throw like just a cryptographic exception with a message that says like the file hash doesn't match, and like give the file name and the hash value that was expected versus the hash that it found or computed.
But you leave the file. So let me tell you why I ask. Because if somebody builds a command line tool that does that, and then the tool crashes, but then somebody forgets to check the error code of the command line tool, but the file is there, then subsequent things will be just continue to work as is, right?
Yeah, it does not actually delete the file. That is a good point.
For usages like this, should verify hash be the default?
Oh, yeah. That would make sense.
In which case, you may want to...
I was thinking cost, but yeah, but you want to be sure that you get the right file always.
Yeah, in which case I would also rename the bool. I would basically negate it. I would say skip verification or skip hash verification.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. So is throwing a cryptographic exception the right one, or is there a better exception? Because I was looking and trying to figure out what I should throw if the hash fails.
Jeremy, do you have opinions on this?
I mean, usually a cryptographic exception is thrown inside a cryptographic operation that has failed, but so where specifically are we looking?
In the download async on the release file, if the hash verification fails, that it throws a cryptographic exception. I couldn't figure if there's a better exception type that I should throw. Because it is technically using the cryptographic APIs to do the hash verification, but it's not.
Yeah. I can't think of a better thing, I guess. Yeah, I mean, you want to use something other than the default message, but
yeah, no, it's got a custom message, and with the file and the 2 hashes that it gives back, like the actual unexpected.
I mean, let me ask you a different question. In which circumstance do I want to skip the verification?
The only reason would be potential cost in terms of like computation time, which shouldn't be that much, but the files are quite big, especially if you're doing a full release. Although, yeah, That would be the only reason why I put it in, is for somebody like if they don't want to do it for some reason, but practically it doesn't make sense. Like if you're downloading a full .NET Core release with all, how many gigabytes, because you want to host it internally, you do want to make sure that the files are correct. So
yeah, I mean, given
there's
that this is
probably
not...
a little bit of over engineering on my part of like, somebody's gonna ask for this at some point.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of my question, because I mean, it seems to me like this is not an operation you do really in a hot loop, right? Like but as soon as you fetch a file from somewhere that is running bits, it seems like you can't really trust that without jumping through a lot of hoops. So you probably should verify it in all cases.
Yeah, I'm trying to find if we have any sort of, content exception or.
Well, we have invalid data exception that you could throw.
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean SQL's corrupt?
I always forgot. I forgot. Like I think it's used by.
Yeah, I thought the data exceptions were like for ADO type stuff.
It's in system IO, so when invalid data is detected in a data stream, so.
Yeah, I think that's but it's thrown by something very specific. I forgot what it was, but like, yeah, it seems like not a terrible exception to throw here.
Yeah, I mean, this one's on IO, so this is the something about you're reading the data and the contents of the data were bad. So I think that's probably a more appropriate thing than the cryptographic exception, which could itself mean that, like, for some reason we asked the OS to compute the hash and it said no.
Yeah.
Yeah, it specifically says if the format of the data in the stream is in an invalid format. So that would be like illegal JSON that I got from a stream, potentially, right?
Well, I mean, it's not wrong, right? You downloaded an MSI, the hashes don't check out, so whatever is in there is probably not a valid MSI, or it's not the MSI you want.
Exactly.
Just checking to see where we ever throw it.
Yeah.
One other question about the release file and the download API is the file name parameter correct? Should that be, that's the destination? Should that be, it's a little ambiguous with the file name property of the
file.
Of the file, and so
should it be
path?
Path should be, I think, more accurate because because it can be a full path, yeah.
I mean, the places that we throw it are like the zip file reader, and when it hits I'm sorry, I expected, a 5, and it's not a 5. So it's sort of appropriate, sort of not.
Yeah, normally I'd say you want to have a stream as well, but in this case, it really doesn't buy you anything to download into a stream. Because you're probably executing this guy, right? And that will not really work very well if it's in a stream somewhere.
Yeah, it's unlikely that you're going to be doing anything with the only places where that might matter is if you grab something like one of the non-Windows files that's like a zip, or like one of the tarballs, and you want to do some extra manipulation, maybe extract. Like if you're writing a tool on top of that, like pull down the file and then grab a tool or a targets file or something like out of like one of the archive type things.
Another question is like, why do you override equals and get a hash code?
Oh, that was so that I could handle like distincts on like all the properties, because distinct didn't always give me
So I would say
I
if you want
I
to,
had the same issue with like the CVEs as well.
yeah, if you want to
where
do that,
data
I
was
would say implement IEquatable on the type itself, because it's
Okay. Yeah, because I mostly use that for places where, like I mentioned earlier, like in some of the release components, there are some files that get duplicated in multiple places. So when you look at the overall product release itself and you ask for the files to get all the files back, I do a distinct on those.
I see.
Because there are duplicate results sometimes given if you just like union all the files together.
Does your JSON converter have to be public?
No, I don't think so.
Same with this guy.
The same goes for the support phase converter then as well.
So let's go look at release component first, because that's the base type. That probably makes the most sense, which I can't find here. Here in the middle. I already did that, right? So that's fine. And then
Yeah, the Windows desktop release component is probably the odd one out, because right now it doesn't have, all the other releases have over time added some additional information.
it seems fine to me. Just from a future-proofing standpoint, that makes sense, and it's probably also easier to understand to do it like this.
Okay.
One question I had was about the miscellaneous version properties, or the the Visual Studio version properties. What's the intended usage of those? Is somebody going to want a strongly typed version?
I've wanted a strongly typed version, but the information there is supposed to be human readable. So the Visual Studio version and the Visual Studio Mac version. So the non-support ones are the version of Visual Studio where that specific release component was inserted for in the first time, which means it is automatically supported. The support properties denote it's a string that's very freeform text, and it denotes all the versions that would support that component. So if you think about something like the SDK, we might have shipped 3.1.400 for the first time in 16.7. But going forward, it will be supported in things like, say, 16.8. So then the data that you'll see would be something like VS 2019, and then in parentheses 16.7, and then comma, and sometimes it would say like, oh, this is like 16.8.4 because it's supported in a servicing release. It's very, very freeform text, and it's human readable. I would like to have it in a non-human readable form as well, because I've needed to interpret that data in the context of, I query a Visual Studio API and I get a version back, and I've got this release that says it supports something, and I have to figure out, is that the case? And it's very difficult to manipulate the two. So I don't know if that's something we can add on the list, Lee. It's a nice to have for me, but those are definitely freeform versions.
Yeah, thinking about that some more is definitely a good idea.
And the other thing for the C# and F#, and I think there's a Visual Basic one, I thought I could make those just plain vanilla versions, except I think there was one place where I saw a Visual Basic version come back as 15.0-preview. So it's neither a version, it's not an actual semver, it's sort of in between. And I can't remember if it actually had like a dash pre or a space. So I just kept them all as just string data.
Yeah, I think those are something where we could probably safely go through and clean up any data that we think is interesting. Because again, it's for the marketing site, and I can't imagine anybody relying on those things right now because they're such a mess.
So yeah, do you think? Yeah, they are a mess. Going forward, we're going to simplify Visual Basic by never changing the number again. So that's where we've had most of the problems in the past. So at any rate, should we have that be a string though, in case in the future some goofy things winds up in there, or should we have it be a formal version there?
Good question.
Because it kind of depends on, given the pipeline we're using, you're sort of responsible for kind of the data hygiene of this. So I think it's a call on your end.
Yeah. I'm inclined to leave it a string.
Me too. I was just saying, if you said we could go with the version, I would trust you, but I definitely tend to a string on this one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because it's goofy. And we don't know if we're going to have 7s and 7.0s, and we just don't know really what we're going to get there.
Yeah.
Actually, it'd be 9 and 10, and that. The only thing, though, Lee, is that if we do it as a string, are we going to have problems sorting it? Are we going to wind, because we're going to be at 10 really soon, and are we going to wind up sorting that like back with C#1?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of feels like a list somebody might want to sort.
I mean, why would you sort by C# version though?
Yeah.
I mean, you would normally.
I'll ask it differently. We won't find 10 if we ask for the highest version from a string. We would get 9, even if 10's available. So
Yeah, but again, why would you be interrogating this file to find the highest version of C#?
You want to find the SDK that supports the highest version of C#, maybe.
What he said.
Okay. That's fair. In which case, yeah, at that point you want something you can compare. I mean, I guess that goes generally back to like, what is the purpose of these things, right? Because strings to me make sense when you display data to the end user, or if you want to find an exact match. Any other policy, you want something strongly typed.
Yeah. So the original purpose was the only purpose that I know of right now is the marketing site for customer display.
Yeah. Well, and I sent you all an invite to the meeting, and one of the questions on there is how we mesh together this as a source of truth for the world and a source of the marketing site. How do we think about that? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for my tool, I've never needed like the F# and C# stuff, but the Visual Studio version, Visual Studio support hasn't, but it will become interesting for my tool eventually when I find what's installed and I'm like, can I install? And I determine like there's a newer SDK out and I want to say, is this SDK compatible with this Visual Studio? Can I actually patch the machine with this? And would I break it? And I have no way of making that determination at this point.
And I'm thinking of a global tool that will rely on this, that is going to be the viewport for users to ask questions of releases.json. And a question, now maybe you'd argue that the best way to approach the question of, what's the SDK with the highest version of C# is to say, well, here's the latest SDK, why are we asking the question? So I think that that's one of those things we should maybe dive a little deeper on. We meet because we're out of time anyway, and I'm afraid I do have to go at time. I do have another meeting. And so I'm going to say goodbye. But the best meeting I could come up with was next Tuesday. So it's a week before we are going to meet again for that small group of 4. If you all feel like we have to do it sooner, then let me know how you feel about lunch meetings and such things, because you guys are a busy group to try to schedule. All right. Bye.
Bye.
All right. Then I will post the notes and then that's it. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Absolutely.
Bye.